He's always quiet. Who knows what is going through his mind? This fella, I know he's up to something. Before we begin this powerful story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your city, your state, and the time they're right now. We always enjoy seeing where our viewers are joining us from around the world. If you enjoy true historical stories filled with mystery, suspense, and powerful lessons from the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story. Now, settle in, because tonight's story begins on a quiet homestead where a simple request would soon turn into something no one could ever forget. This is the story of Pretty Kate and the enslaved man named Jedediah. It began on a warm evening in the rolling hills of Kentucky during the year 1858. The sun was slowly sinking behind vast tobacco fields, and long shadows stretched across the dusty ground. The plantation looked peaceful from far away, but the people who lived and worked there knew that peace was often only an illusion. Among the many enslaved workers, there was a tall and quiet man named Jedediah. He was known among the others as someone who spoke little but observed everything. His eyes were calm but deep, as if they carried stories that he never allowed himself to tell. No one knew exactly where Jedediah had been born. Some said he came from the Tidewater region of Virginia. Others whispered he had once tried to escape from another plantation far away and had been sold again as punishment. But Jedediah never confirmed any story. He simply worked, kept his head down, and survived each day the best way he could. The owner of the plantation was a wealthy widow who lived in a large white house on the hill. Her name was Catherine Whitmore, though almost everyone simply called her Pretty Kate. People used that name not only because of her beauty, but also because she carried herself with a strange charm that made it difficult to understand what she truly felt. Some days she seemed gentle and soft-spoken. Other days she could become cold and distant in a way that made even her own household servants nervous. Many of the enslaved workers avoided looking directly at her when she passed by, because they never knew which version of her they would see. Pretty Kate had inherited the plantation after the sudden death of her husband several years earlier. He had been known as a strict and sometimes cruel man. But Kate surprised many people when she took control of the estate. Instead of immediately selling everything, she decided to manage it herself. Some neighbors admired her courage, but others whispered that a young widow managing such a large plantation alone was unusual and perhaps even dangerous. Over time, people began noticing that Kate often walked the property late in the evening, long after the overseers had returned to their homes. Sometimes she stood near the fields, watching the workers finish their day. Sometimes she walked slowly near the slave quarters, listening quietly to their songs and conversations. The enslaved people noticed this too, though they did not know what it meant. Jedediah had seen her many times during those silent walks. He would feel her gaze lingering on him longer than the others. At first, he ignored it. Life on a plantation taught a man to avoid attention whenever possible. Attention could bring trouble faster than a storm rolling across the sky. Yet, something about Pretty Kate's gaze always felt different. It was not the cold look of a master examining property. It was something more curious, more thoughtful, almost as if she were studying him for reasons she had not yet revealed. One evening, while Jedediah was carrying firewood toward the main house, Kate appeared suddenly at the doorway. The lantern light from inside the house lit her face, while the dark yard behind him remained silent. She watched him place the wood near the steps before speaking in a calm voice. "Jedediah," she said softly, "how long have you worked here?" Jedediah paused, unsure why she was asking. "5 years, ma'am," He answered carefully. She nodded slowly, as if she already knew the answer, but wanted to hear his voice say it. Then she smiled faintly and thanked him before stepping back inside the house. It was a short moment, but Jedediah felt something strange about it. That night, he slept lightly, as though his instincts were warning him that the quiet balance of his life on the plantation was beginning to shift. Days passed, and the memory of that small conversation slowly faded. But the pattern of Kate's behavior did not. She began appearing more often where Jedediah was working. Sometimes she asked small questions about the fields. Sometimes she simply stood nearby without speaking. The overseer noticed this as well and grew uneasy. Overseers did not like surprises, especially when it involved the attention of the plantation owner. One afternoon, the overseer pulled Jedediah aside and spoke to him in a low voice. "You keep your distance from the mistress," he warned. "Trouble follows strange attention in places like this." Jedediah nodded respectfully, though he had no control over when or where Kate appeared. As weeks went by, the air around the plantation seemed to grow heavier with unspoken tension. The other enslaved workers began whispering quietly among themselves. They had seen this kind of attention before on other plantations, and it rarely ended peacefully. But what they did not know was that Kate herself was fighting a storm of thoughts inside her mind. Since inheriting the estate, she had lived surrounded by wealth and power. Yet, she often felt an emptiness that frightened her. The house was large and quiet at night. The long hallways echoed with memories of a husband she had never truly loved. She watched the enslaved workers laughing together in the distance, and sometimes wondered how people with so little could still find moments of joy. Jedediah in particular fascinated her because of his silence. He carried himself with a dignity she rarely saw among men who lived under chains. It made her question things she had never questioned before. But curiosity can be dangerous in a world built on strict rules. One evening, the sun dipped low and painted the sky deep orange as the workers finished their tasks. Jedediah was preparing to return to the quarters when a house servant approached him quickly. "The mistress wants you at the house," the servant said quietly. Jedediah felt his stomach tighten. Being called to the house after sunset rarely meant anything simple. He wiped the dust from his hands and walked slowly up the hill toward the large white building. The windows glowed with lantern light, and the evening air carried the faint smell of rain approaching from the distant hills. Inside the house, the wooden floors creaked softly under Jedediah's steps as he followed the servant down a long hallway. The walls were lined with portraits of people who had owned the land before Kate. Their painted eyes seemed to watch every movement. Finally, the servant stopped near the staircase and motioned toward the sitting room. "She is inside," the servant whispered before quietly disappearing down another corridor. Jedediah stepped into the room and removed his hat. Pretty Kate stood near the window, looking out into the darkening fields. For several seconds, she did not turn around. The silence stretched long enough for Jedediah to hear the slow ticking of a clock on the wall. At last, she turned and studied him with a thoughtful expression. "Jedediah," she said gently, "I need your help tonight." Jedediah kept his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am." She walked closer, the soft light of the lantern reflecting in her eyes. "I am feeling unwell this evening," she said. "The stairs feel longer than usual tonight. I need someone strong to carry me to my room upstairs." The request was unusual, but not impossible. Enslaved workers were often ordered to perform many kinds of labor inside the house. Yet, something in her tone made the moment feel heavier than a simple command. Jedediah hesitated for the smallest moment before nodding. "If that is what you wish, ma'am, Kate smiled in a way that seemed both relieved and strangely nervous. She stepped closer and gestured toward the staircase. Jedediah knelt carefully and allowed her to climb onto his back. As he stood, he felt how light she was, almost fragile compared to the heavy loads he carried every day in the fields. Slowly, he began climbing the staircase while the lantern light flickered against the walls. Each step creaked under their weight, and the house seemed unusually quiet, as if every room were holding its breath. Jedediah focused on reaching the top, but he could not ignore the strange feeling that something important was about to happen. When they reached the second-floor hallway, Kate leaned slightly closer and whispered softly near his ear, "Thank you, Jedediah. Just a few more steps." But what happened after he entered that room would soon become a story whispered across the plantation for years. Because the moment the door closed behind them, the quiet order of that world began to crack in a way no one could have imagined. Jedediah stepped into the room slowly, feeling the soft carpet beneath his bare feet. The door behind him closed with a quiet click. The sound was small, but inside the silent hallway, it felt louder than thunder. Pretty Kate was still on his back, her arms resting gently over his shoulders. Jedediah carefully lowered himself so she could step down onto the floor. When she did, she walked slowly toward the bed near the far wall and sat down, smoothing the folds of her long dress. The room was large and warm. A lantern burned on the bedside table, casting a golden glow that made the shadows dance softly on the walls. Outside the tall window, the night had fully settled over the plantation. Crickets sang in the distance, and the wind moved gently through the tall tobacco fields. Jedediah stood near the door, waiting for another command. In the world he lived in, an enslaved man never assumed he was free to leave a room unless he was clearly told so. Pretty Kate watched him quietly for a long moment. Her eyes studied him with an intensity that made the air between them feel thick and uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke in a calm voice. "You may come closer, Jedediah. I wish to speak with you for a moment." Jedediah obeyed, stepping forward until he stood a few feet away from the bed. His mind moved carefully through every possibility. Being alone in the mistress's bedroom at night was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical work. One wrong word or misunderstood action could destroy a life. Kate folded her hands in her lap and tilted her head slightly. "Tell me something honestly, Jedediah," she said softly. "Are you afraid of me?" The question surprised him. Enslaved people were afraid of many things: punishment, hunger, separation from family. But no one asked them to describe that fear out loud. Jedediah answered carefully, "A man in my position learns to be careful around everyone, ma'am." Kate smiled faintly, though her eyes carried a deeper sadness. "Careful is a wise way to live," she said. "But I asked if you are afraid of me." Jedediah hesitated for a moment before replying again. "I respect the power you hold over my life, ma'am." That answer seemed to satisfy her, at least for the moment. She leaned back slightly on the bed and studied him, as though she were trying to solve a difficult puzzle. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The ticking of the small clock on the wall filled the silence again. Kate finally stood up from the bed and walked slowly toward the window. Her long dress brushed softly across the wooden floor as she moved. From where she stood, she could see the faint lantern lights glowing near the slave quarters far down the hill. She spoke again without turning around. "Sometimes I watch the fields at night, Jedediah. I see the fires burning near the cabins, and I hear the people singing together. Your voices carry farther than you think." Jedediah listened quietly. He had heard those songs his entire life. They were not only songs of sorrow. They were songs of memory, songs that helped people remember who they were even when the world tried to strip that identity away. Kate continued speaking, her voice softer now. Do you know something strange, Jedediah? Sometimes those songs sound more alive than anything inside this house. Jedediah did not know how to respond to that. The distance between their lives was too great for honest conversation. Yet Kate seemed determined to step closer to that dangerous line. She turned slowly and looked directly at him again. You intrigue me, Jedediah, she said plainly. You walk through this place like a man carrying a secret strength inside him. Even when the overseer shouts or the others complain, you remain quiet. Why is that? Jedediah felt the tension rising in his chest. There was no safe answer to such questions. He chose the simplest truth he could offer. Silence keeps a man alive longer, ma'am. Kate nodded slowly as though she expected that answer. Yes, she said softly. Silence is powerful. But silence also hides many things. She walked toward him again until only a few steps separated them. Jedediah could feel the warmth of the lantern light on his face and the steady beat of his own heart. Kate studied him carefully before speaking once more. I asked you here tonight because I wanted to understand something. For years, I have lived in this house surrounded by people who obey every order I give. Yet none of them look at the world the way you do. When you work in the fields, you do not move like a broken man. You move like someone who is simply waiting. Waiting for what? Jedediah. Jedediah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He kept his eyes lowered as tradition demanded. I wait for the end of the day like every other man here, ma'am. Kate shook her head slowly. No, she said quietly. That is not what I mean. The lantern flickered gently as a breeze slipped through the slightly open window. Outside, the night seemed deeper now, and the distant songs from the slave quarters had begun to fade as people settled down to sleep. Inside the room, the tension between them continued to grow. Kate walked back toward the bed, but did not sit down this time. Instead, she leaned one hand against the wooden bedpost and looked at Jedediah again with a thoughtful expression. Let me ask you something different, she said. If a man suddenly found himself free, truly free, what would he do first? Jedediah's head lifted slightly before he could stop himself. The word, free, carried a dangerous power in a place like this. People had been punished severely for speaking too openly about freedom. He answered slowly, a man who has never known freedom may not understand it right away. Kate nodded thoughtfully. That is true, she said. But imagine for a moment that he did understand it. Imagine the door was opened and he could walk anywhere he wished. Where would he go? Jedediah felt a long, buried memory stir inside his mind. He remembered stories his mother once told him when he was very young. Stories about rivers that flowed endlessly and forests where a person could walk for days without hearing the crack of a whip. He spoke carefully. I would find a place where my family could live without fear. A place where a man's work belonged to him and not to another. Kate listened closely to every word. When he finished speaking, she lowered her eyes briefly as though something inside her heart had shifted. The strange thing, Jedediah, she said quietly, is that I have everything this world promises. Land, money, power. Yet sometimes I feel like the one living behind the locked door. Jedediah did not know how to answer that confession. The idea that the mistress of the plantation could feel trapped seemed almost impossible to understand. Kate walked slowly toward the small table beside the bed and picked up a folded piece of paper. She held it between her fingers for a moment before turning back toward Jedediah. Do you know what this is? She asked. Jedediah shook his head slightly. No, ma'am. She looked down at the paper again, her expression becoming more serious. This document could change more lives than you realize, she said softly. Jedediah felt a chill run through his body, even though the room was warm. Something about the way she spoke told him that the night was moving toward a moment neither of them could take back. Kate placed the paper gently on the table again and walked closer to him, until they stood only a few steps apart. The air felt almost electric with unspoken tension. "Jedediah," she said carefully, "I have been thinking about the nature of power for a long time. My husband believed power meant control, fear, and punishment. But lately, I wonder if true power might mean something entirely different." Jedediah remained silent, unsure where this conversation was leading. Kate continued, "Tonight, when I asked you to carry me upstairs, it was not because I was too weak to climb those steps." Jedediah's eyes lifted slightly in surprise. Kate watched his reaction closely before finishing her thought. "I wanted to see how you would respond when placed in a moment where the rules of this world felt uncertain." Jedediah felt the room spin slightly with confusion. He said slowly, "I do not understand what you mean." Kate sighed softly and walked back toward the window again. Outside, a thin layer of clouds had begun to cover the moon, making the night darker than before. She rested her hands on the window frame and looked out over the land she owned. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet seriousness that Jedediah had never heard from her before. "Jedediah," she said, "what I'm about to tell you could destroy both of us if the wrong person hears about it." Jedediah's muscles tensed immediately. Danger finally stepped fully into the room. Kate turned back toward him and spoke slowly, choosing each word with great care. "For months, I have been studying the laws of this state. I have been speaking secretly with a lawyer in the town of Frankfort, several miles away." Jedediah felt his heart beating harder with every word. Kate continued, "According to the law, the owner of a plantation has the right to grant freedom to any enslaved person under certain conditions." Jedediah stared at her, unsure if he had heard correctly. Freedom was a word that rarely entered real conversation on plantations. Kate stepped closer again and lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "The paper on that table is a legal document, Jedediah. If it is signed and approved by the county court, it would grant freedom to one man." Jedediah felt the world shift beneath his feet. For a moment he could not even breathe properly. Kate watched his face carefully. "Yes," she said quietly. "You understand what I am saying." Jedediah forced his voice to remain steady. "Why tell me this, ma'am?" Kate hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because the man named in that document is you." The silence that followed felt endless. Jedediah could hear nothing but the pounding of his own heart. Freedom. The word echoed through his mind like distant thunder. But he had lived long enough to know that hope could be more dangerous than chains. He looked at Kate carefully and spoke with caution. "Nothing in this world comes without a price. What would you ask in return?" Kate's expression changed slightly, a mixture of sadness and determination. "That, Jedediah," she said quietly, "is the question that makes this moment more dangerous than you realize. Because if I choose to sign that paper tonight, the consequences will not stop with your freedom alone. The entire plantation could change in ways neither of us can control. And before morning comes, someone else in this house may discover what we have done." Jedediah felt the cold edge of reality cutting through the fragile dream that had just appeared. Outside, the wind began to rise slightly, rattling the window shutters as if the night itself were warning them. Inside the room, the lantern flame flickered again, casting long shadows across the walls. Kate looked at Jedediah one more time and spoke a sentence that made his blood run cold. "Jedediah," she said slowly, Before I decide what to do with that paper, there is something you must know. Someone in this house has been watching you very closely. And if they learn what I am planning tonight, your life may end before the sun rises." Jedediah stood completely still after hearing Kate's final words. The room suddenly felt colder, even though the lantern was still burning on the small wooden table. Someone in the house had been watching him. That single thought moved through his mind like a slow shadow. On a plantation, being watched usually meant danger. Jedediah had learned long ago that quiet survival depended on staying unnoticed. Yet now the mistress herself was telling him that someone had been observing his movements closely. He lifted his eyes carefully and looked at pretty Kate. Her expression was serious, no longer curious or soft like before. She looked like a person standing on the edge of a decision that could destroy her entire life. Jedediah finally spoke, choosing his words with great care. "Who is watching me, ma'am?" Kate hesitated before answering. The silence between them stretched long enough for the wind outside to push gently against the window shutters. At last, she spoke in a low voice. "The overseer." "Thomas Reed." Jedediah felt a small knot tighten in his chest. The name did not surprise him. Thomas Reed had worked on the plantation for several years and was known for his sharp eyes and suspicious nature. He watched the enslaved workers constantly, always searching for the smallest sign of rebellion or escape. Jedediah had noticed Reed studying him more than once in the past, but he had assumed it was simply the overseer doing his job. Kate continued speaking quietly. "Reed has come to me several times during the past few weeks. Each time, he told me he believed something unusual was happening among the workers. He claimed one of them was becoming too confident, too calm, as if he believed the rules no longer applied to him." Jedediah understood immediately who Reed meant. Confidence in a place like that could easily be mistaken for defiance. Kate walked slowly back toward the bed and sat down again, folding her hands together as if she were gathering her thoughts. "Reed told me that man was you," she said plainly. "He believes you may be planning something, perhaps an escape or even encouraging others to do the same." Jedediah kept his face calm, though inside he felt the danger rising like floodwater. Rumors of rebellion were taken very seriously in those years. Even a whisper of such an idea could lead to violent punishment. Kate watched him carefully, studying every small change in his expression. "Do not worry, Jedediah," she said quietly. "I told Reed I saw no sign of such behavior from you, but I could tell he did not fully believe me. He has been watching more closely ever since." Jedediah thought about the long days in the fields and the many times he had felt Reed's eyes on him from across the rows of tobacco. Now, the meaning of those looks became clearer. The overseer had already decided Jedediah was a man to watch. Kate leaned slightly forward on the bed. "That is why tonight is so dangerous," she continued. "If Reed learns that I brought you into this room after dark, he will begin asking questions. Questions that could lead him to that paper on the table." Jedediah glanced briefly toward the folded document resting beside the lantern. The idea that it contained his freedom still felt almost impossible to believe. Yet the danger surrounding it was very real. He spoke slowly. "If Reed believes I am planning something, then my freedom would only confirm his suspicions." Kate nodded. "Exactly. And men like Reed do not react kindly when they believe they have been deceived." Jedediah understood that better than anyone. Overseers built their authority on fear. If Reed felt his control slipping, he might try to reassert it with violence. Kate stood again and walked across the room with restless steps. "For months I have been considering this decision," she said quietly. "But I never imagined the moment would arrive with such risks surrounding it." Jedediah remained silent, allowing her to continue. She stopped near the table and picked up the folded paper once more. The lantern light reflected softly across the surface of the document. "I wrote your name here 3 weeks ago. Jedediah," she said. "I did it late at night when the house was quiet. My hands were shaking the entire time." Jedediah watched her closely, still uncertain whether this moment was real or some strange test. Kate looked directly at him again. "Do you know why I chose you?" Jedediah shook his head slightly. "No, Mom." She paused before answering, as though searching for the right words. "Because you remind me that dignity can exist even in the worst conditions. I have seen men with power behave like animals, yet I have seen you endure hardship without losing yourself. That realization changed something inside me." Jedediah absorbed her words slowly. Compliments from a plantation owner were rare, but they did not erase the reality of the system surrounding them. He spoke carefully again. "Freedom is not only about one man, Mame. The others will remain in chains." Kate lowered her eyes briefly, acknowledging the truth in his statement. "I know that," she said softly, "and perhaps one day I will face that larger decision as well. But tonight I can only begin with what is possible." The wind outside grew stronger, and a faint rumble of distant thunder rolled across the dark sky. A storm was forming somewhere beyond the hills. Kate placed the document back on the table and stepped closer to Jedediah again. "I plan to send this paper to the county court next week," she explained. "Once approved, it would allow you to leave this plantation as a free man." Jedediah felt a powerful mix of hope and fear rising within him. Freedom was a dream he had never allowed himself to imagine too clearly. Now it stood only a few steps away, yet surrounded by shadows of danger. Kate continued speaking. "But Reed's suspicion has complicated everything. If he senses something unusual, he may search the house or question the servants. The moment he discovers this document, he will know exactly what it means." Jedediah understood the risk instantly. The overseer might destroy the paper or accuse Jedediah of manipulating the mistress. Either accusation could end violently. Kate walked slowly toward the door and listened for a moment. The hallway outside remained quiet. She turned back toward Jedediah with renewed urgency. "There is another reason I asked you to carry me to this room tonight." Jedediah looked at her attentively. "What reason, ma'am?" Kate took a deep breath before answering. "I needed to know whether you would trust me, if the moment required it." Jedediah felt the weight of that question settle between them. Trust was rare in a world built on ownership and control. Yet the sincerity in Kate's voice suggested she truly meant what she was saying. He spoke honestly. Trust is difficult for a man who has spent his life being owned by others. Kate nodded slowly. "I expected that answer. But tonight we may both need to trust each other more than we ever planned." Outside, the thunder sounded again, louder now, and the first drops of rain tapped softly against the window glass. The storm was arriving quickly. The lantern flame flickered as the wind pushed through the cracks around the shutters. Jedediah noticed the shadows in the room shifting across the walls. Kate returned to the table and unfolded the paper slightly, revealing the dark ink of written words across its surface. "This document still needs my signature," she said quietly. "Without that signature, it means nothing." Jedediah studied the paper from a distance. His name written there felt like a doorway that had suddenly appeared in the middle of a locked room. Kate picked up a pen lying beside the lantern. The small metal tip caught the light as she held it between her fingers. "If I sign this tonight, Jedediah, there will be no turning back. By tomorrow morning, the process will begin, and within weeks, you could be a free man." Jedediah felt his breath slow as he considered the magnitude of that possibility. But Kate did not sign immediately. Instead, she lowered the pen slowly and looked toward the door again. "There is still one problem," she said. Jedediah followed her gaze toward the dark hallway beyond the door. "Reed," he said quietly. "Yes," Kate replied. Reed rarely sleeps deeply during storms. He often walks through the house to check that everything is secure. If he sees light in my room and finds you here, he will start asking questions immediately. Jedediah understood that such questions could quickly become accusations. Kate's voice became more urgent. "We must decide quickly what to do." Jedediah thought carefully. "If I leave now, Reed may see me returning to the quarters." Kate nodded. "Exactly. But if you remain here too long, the risk grows even greater." The thunder outside cracked loudly, shaking the window glass. Rain began falling harder against the roof of the house. For a moment, both of them simply listened to the sound of the storm. Then something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the hallway outside came the faint creak of a floorboard. Both of them froze instantly. Someone was walking in the corridor. The slow footsteps moved closer, accompanied by the soft jingle of metal keys. Jedediah recognized that sound immediately. Overseers often carried keys to storage rooms and locked doors around the plantation house. Kate's eyes widened slightly as the footsteps approached the door. Reed was awake, and he was moving directly toward her room. Jedediah felt his pulse hammering in his chest as he looked around quickly. There was nowhere obvious to hide in the open space of the bedroom. Kate reacted instantly. She grabbed the folded document from the table and pressed it into Jedediah's hand. "Hide this," she whispered urgently. Jedediah hesitated for only a fraction of a second before slipping the paper inside his shirt. The footsteps outside stopped directly in front of the door. A shadow moved across the thin line of light visible beneath it. Reed's deep voice then sounded from the hallway, calm but suspicious. "Mistress Kate, are you awake in there?" The storm outside roared louder, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Inside the room, Jedediah and Kate exchanged one quick glance filled with fear and determination, because in the next few seconds, one small mistake could expose everything they had just risked their lives to protect. The knocking came slowly but firmly. 3 hard taps against the wooden door. Jedediah felt the sound travel through his chest like a drum. Pretty Kate stood still for a moment, her eyes fixed on the door, as if she were deciding how to face the danger waiting on the other side. The storm outside had grown stronger. Rain struck the roof in steady waves, and thunder rolled across the sky. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then Kate lifted her chin and whispered quickly to Jedediah, "Stand near the window and say nothing unless I ask you to speak." Jedediah nodded once and moved quietly to the side of the room where the tall curtains hung beside the window. The folded document pressed against his chest beneath his shirt, and he could feel the paper growing warm from his skin. The overseer knocked again, louder this time. "Mistress Kate," he called through the door. "I saw the light from the hallway and wanted to make sure everything is all right." Kate walked toward the door with slow, controlled steps. Her voice changed instantly into the calm tone she used whenever speaking to people in the house. "Yes, Mr. Reed. I am awake. Is something the matter?" There was a short pause before Reed answered.
"No, ma'am,"
he said. "But the storm woke me, and I thought I heard footsteps earlier." But Kate rested her hand on the door handle, but did not open it yet. Her mind was moving quickly, choosing the safest path through the situation. "You heard footsteps because I asked one of the workers to assist me earlier this evening," she replied calmly. "I was feeling weak and needed help reaching my room." Outside the door, Reed seemed to consider that explanation carefully. Jedediah could hear the faint sound of the man shifting his weight in the hallway. Finally, Reed spoke again. "Which worker?" "Ma'am." Kate answered without hesitation. "Jedediah." The name hung in the air like a sudden crack of lightning. Jedediah stood motionless near the window. The storm flashed outside, lighting the room with brief white bursts through the glass. Reed's voice came again, slightly sharper now. "Jedediah is still in there with you, ma'am?" Kate opened the door slowly. "Yes," she said simply. "He was about to leave before you knocked." Reed stepped into the doorway. The lantern light from the room illuminated his tall figure and stern face. Water from the storm had dampened his coat, and small drops slid from the brim of his hat onto the wooden floor. His eyes moved immediately across the room until they stopped on Jedediah. For a moment, the overseer said nothing. He simply studied the enslaved man with the cold patience of someone who believed. He had finally confirmed a suspicion. Jedediah lowered his eyes respectfully as expected, though he could feel Reed's gaze examining every detail of his posture. Reed removed his hat slowly and spoke in a calm but tight voice. "It is unusual for a worker to remain inside the mistress's room at this hour." Kate answered before Jedediah could speak. "He stayed because the storm began suddenly, and I asked him to wait until it settled," she said. Reed looked toward the window, where rain continued beating heavily against the glass. A storm is no reason for a field worker to remain in the main house, he replied. Kate's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Reed," she said, "you seem very interested in my personal decisions tonight." Reed gave a small, respectful nod, but did not look away from Jedediah. "My responsibility is the safety of the plantation, ma'am. When unusual situations occur, I believe it is my duty to understand them." Kate stepped fully into the doorway, placing herself between Reed and the rest of the room. "The worker has done exactly as I asked," she said firmly. "He will return to the quarters immediately." Reed's eyes shifted slowly from Jedediah back to Kate. "Of course, ma'am," he said, "if that is your wish." The situation might end peacefully. Jedediah prepared to walk past the overseer and leave the house as quickly as possible. But Reed did not move aside. Instead, he stepped farther into the room, his boots leaving small, wet marks on the polished floor. His eyes traveled across the furniture, the table, and finally the lantern beside the folded cloth where the document had been resting earlier. Something in the room had clearly caught his attention. Jedediah's heart beat harder as he realized the overseer was searching for signs of hidden activity. Reed walked slowly toward the table. "Stormy nights often make people restless," he said casually. "People wander when they should be sleeping. Sometimes they start thinking about things that could cause trouble." Kate followed him with her eyes, her voice steady but tense. "Mr. Reed, I believe you have already confirmed that nothing improper is happening here." Reed stopped beside the table and looked down at the empty space where the paper had been only minutes earlier. "Perhaps," he replied slowly, "but sometimes trouble hides in small details." He turned and faced Jedediah again. "Tell me something, Jedediah. Why were you really here tonight?" Jedediah answered in the simplest way possible. "The mistress asked me to carry her upstairs, sir." Reed nodded slowly. "Yes, I heard that part of the story. But what happened after that?" Jedediah remained silent for a moment before replying. "I waited for her instructions, sir." Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are a quiet man, Jedediah. Quiet men often think more than they speak." The storm flashed again outside, filling the room with a sudden white glow before darkness returned. Kate stepped closer to Reed, her patience beginning to fade. "That will be enough questioning, Mr. Reed. The worker has answered you already. Reed lifted one hand calmly. Of course, ma'am. I meant no offense. But there was something in his tone that suggested he was far from satisfied. Reed began walking slowly around the room, as if examining it from different angles. Jedediah watched him carefully, aware that the document hidden beneath his shirt could end both their lives if discovered. The overseer paused near the window, where Jedediah had been standing earlier. He looked out at the rain for a moment before speaking again. You know, ma'am, I have managed plantations for many years. I have learned that rebellion rarely begins with loud voices. It begins quietly, with small secrets and private meetings. Kate's eyes flashed with anger. Are you accusing me of encouraging rebellion in my own house, Mr. Reed? Reed turned slowly and smiled thinly. Not accusing, ma'am. Observing. He glanced again toward Jedediah. Some workers carry themselves differently. When they believe change is coming, confidence grows in strange ways. Jedediah understood the dangerous path the overseer was walking. Reed was building a story piece by piece, testing whether Kate or Jedediah would reveal something by accident. Kate stepped forward firmly. Mr. Reed, your duty is to manage the fields and maintain order among the workers. My private decisions are not part of that responsibility. Reed bowed his head slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. Of course, Mom. Yet the safety of this property depends on understanding the mood of the people who work it. Jedediah felt the room tightening around them like a trap. The storm outside roared louder, thunder shaking the window frame. Reed's gaze drifted once more across the table, the bed, and finally toward Jedediah's chest, where the hidden paper rested beneath the cloth of his shirt. For a moment, Jedediah feared the man could somehow see through the fabric. Reed stepped closer. You seem nervous tonight, Jedediah, he said quietly. Jedediah answered calmly. The storm is loud, sir. Reed studied his face carefully, searching for signs of fear or dishonesty. Perhaps that is all it is, he said. But before leaving, I think it would be wise to make sure nothing unusual is happening here. Kate's voice sharpened instantly. What exactly do you mean by that? Reed spoke slowly, almost politely. I believe it would be wise for the worker to empty his pockets before returning to the quarters. Jedediah felt the air vanish from his lungs. The document was not in his pockets. But Reed's request showed that the overseer's suspicion had reached a dangerous level. Kate's face turned pale with anger. That will not be necessary, she said firmly. Reed held her gaze without blinking. With respect. Ma'am, he replied. If there is nothing to hide, then such a request should cause no concern. The tension in the room rose like heat before a fire. Jedediah knew the truth. If Reed searched him thoroughly, the hidden paper might be discovered. Kate understood the same risk. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the sound of another loud thunderclap shook the entire house. At that exact moment, a sudden crash echoed from somewhere downstairs. It sounded like a heavy object falling in the hallway below. All three of them turned their heads toward the door. Reed frowned immediately. What was that? He muttered. Kate spoke quickly. Perhaps a window shutter broke in the storm. Reed hesitated, clearly torn between investigating the noise and continuing his interrogation. Another loud crash followed from downstairs, this time accompanied by the sound of glass shattering. Reed's instincts finally took control. Stay here, he said sharply before moving toward the hallway. I will see what caused that. He stepped out of the room and disappeared down the corridor. Kate moved instantly and closed the door behind him. For a moment, both she and Jedediah stood frozen, listening to Reed's footsteps fading down the staircase. The storm outside continued roaring, but the sudden silence inside the bedroom felt even louder. Kate turned toward Jedediah with wide eyes. "Someone downstairs may have just saved us," she whispered. Jedediah carefully removed the folded document from inside his shirt and looked at it again in the lantern light. The paper that carried his freedom now felt heavier than ever. Because somewhere in the house, a mysterious crash had distracted the overseer, and neither of them knew whether it had been an accident, a broken window, or something far more dangerous moving through the dark halls of the plantation. For several long seconds after Reed's footsteps disappeared down the staircase, the room remained completely silent, except for the storm outside. Rain hammered the roof like thousands of tiny drums, and the wind pushed hard against the wooden shutters. Pretty Kate stood beside the closed door, with one hand pressed against it, listening carefully to the sounds below. Jedediah remained near the center of the room, holding the folded document that could change his life forever. The lantern flame flickered and stretched the shadows across the walls. Neither of them spoke at first. Both were trying to understand what had just happened. Finally, Kate stepped away from the door and looked toward Jedediah. That noise downstairs could not have come at a more important moment, she whispered. Jedediah nodded slowly. Whoever or whatever caused it may have saved us tonight. Kate moved toward the window and pulled the curtain slightly aside, peering out into the dark yard. Lightning flashed across the sky, revealing the tall tobacco fields bending under the force of the wind. The slave quarters were barely visible in the distance, small lantern lights glowing faintly through the rain. Kate lowered the curtain again and turned back toward Jedediah. "The question now is whether that noise was an accident or something else," she said quietly. Jedediah understood her meaning. If someone had entered the house during the storm, Reed would soon discover it. And if that intruder happened to move upstairs, the situation could become even more dangerous. Jedediah slipped the document back inside his shirt carefully. "The overseer may return soon," he said. Kate nodded. "Yes, and if he comes back before we decide what to do, this moment may disappear forever." She walked quickly toward the table, where the pen still lay beside the lantern. Her eyes moved between the pen and Jedediah, as though measuring the weight of the choice in front of her. Jedediah watched her carefully. The paper hidden against his chest felt almost unreal, yet the danger surrounding it was painfully real. Kate picked up the pen again and held it above the document, though she had not yet unfolded it. Her hand trembled slightly. "Jedediah," she said softly, "if I sign this tonight, everything changes. Not only for you, but for this entire house. Reed will question it, the neighbors will question it, and the court may even challenge it." Jedediah answered quietly, "Freedom has always frightened those who profit from chains." Kate looked at him thoughtfully. "You speak like a man who has thought deeply about these things." Jedediah lowered his eyes again. "A man with little power often spends his life thinking about power, ma'am." Kate unfolded the document slowly and placed it flat on the table. The ink of Jedediah's name stood clear under the lantern light. Outside, the thunder rolled again, louder than before. Kate lifted the pen once more, but before the tip touched the paper, another sound drifted faintly up the staircase. This time it was not a crash. It was a voice, Reed's voice. He was shouting something to someone below. The words were difficult to understand through the storm, but the tone was sharp and angry. Kate moved quickly back to the door and pressed her ear against it. Jedediah listened as well, though the rain and thunder swallowed most of the conversation. After a few seconds, Kate stepped back, her expression more serious than before. "Reed is not alone downstairs," she said. Jedediah felt a cold wave move through his chest. Who else would be in the house during a storm like this? Kate spoke slowly. I believe one of the house servants may have knocked over something in the hallway. Reed is questioning them. Jedediah nodded, though his instincts told him something else might be happening. Storms often created confusion on plantations. Sometimes workers moved quietly through the darkness, hoping to reach loved ones in other cabins. Sometimes thieves from nearby towns used the noise of the storm to hide their movements. And sometimes desperate people used the chaos to attempt escape. Kate looked toward the document again. "We cannot wait much longer," she said firmly. She returned to the table and held the pen over the paper once more. Jedediah watched every movement carefully. The storm outside grew even stronger, shaking the window frames. Kate took a deep breath. "Jedediah," she said quietly, "before I sign this, I must ask you something very important." Jedediah lifted his eyes slightly. "Yes, ma'am. If you leave this plantation as a free man, will you disappear quietly into the world, or will you use that freedom to fight against this system?" Jedediah felt the weight of the question settle deep in his chest. It was not simply a question about his future. It was a question about Kate's own safety. If Jedediah used his freedom to speak openly against slavery, many people might look back at the moment he received that freedom and blame Kate for encouraging rebellion. Jedediah answered slowly and honestly, "Freedom does not erase a man's memory. I will always remember what life was like here, but my first duty would be to build a life where my family can live safely." Kate studied his face carefully. "Do you have family somewhere, Jedediah?" He nodded once. "My mother was sold many years ago to a plantation in Georgia. I do not know if she still lives, but if I ever gained freedom, I would search for her." Kate lowered her eyes slightly, as though imagining that journey. Families separated by slavery were a painful truth she could no longer ignore. She lifted the pen again, determination growing in her expression. "Then perhaps tonight is the night that journey begins," she said quietly. The pen finally touched the paper. The sound of ink moving across the document was soft, but powerful. With careful strokes, Kate wrote her signature beneath Jedediah's name. When she finished, she set the pen down slowly and looked at the signed document as if she were seeing it for the first time. "It is done," she whispered. Jedediah felt his chest tighten with emotion he had buried for most of his life. The idea that a single piece of paper could open the door to freedom felt almost impossible to understand. But before either of them could speak again, heavy footsteps rushed quickly up the staircase outside. Reed was returning. Kate reacted immediately. "Fold the paper and hide it again," she whispered urgently. Jedediah moved fast, slipping the signed document back beneath his shirt. The footsteps grew louder in the hallway until they stopped directly outside the door. This time Reed did not knock. He pushed the door open quickly and stepped inside, breathing slightly harder, as if he had been moving fast. His eyes moved between Kate and Jedediah instantly. "Something strange is happening outside," Reed said sharply. Kate forced her voice to remain calm. "What do you mean?" Reed stepped farther into the room, rainwater still dripping from his coat. "One of the barn doors was forced open during the storm," he explained. "And when I went to check it, I found fresh footprints in the mud near the backfield." Jedediah felt a chill run through his body. Footprints during a storm meant someone had been moving across the plantation recently. Reed continued speaking. "At first, I thought it might be one of the workers trying to reach another cabin, but the tracks were heading away from the quarters and toward the woods." Kate frowned slightly. "Perhaps someone attempted to escape during the storm." Reed nodded slowly. "That is exactly what I believe." His eyes shifted toward Jedediah again. "And I find it very interesting that this is the same night I discover you alone in the mistress's room after dark." Jedediah kept his expression calm, though inside he felt the danger closing in once more. Kate stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Reed, that is a serious accusation without evidence." Reed crossed his arms. "Perhaps. But if someone is escaping tonight, they may have had help." The room fell silent again. The storm continued raging outside as the overseer studied Jedediah with growing suspicion. Then Reed spoke again, his voice slow and dangerous. "I believe it would be wise to gather the men and search the property before dawn. And Jedediah," he added slowly, "I think you should join us in that search. Because if a worker truly escaped tonight, the person who helped them might be standing in this room right now." Jedediah felt the signed document pressing against his chest like a burning secret. If Reed forced him to search the fields all night, the risk of discovery would grow with every passing hour. And somewhere out in the storm, someone might indeed be running for freedom through the dark woods beyond the plantation. But the question now was far more dangerous. Had that unknown escape truly happened by accident, or had someone inside the plantation planned it as a distraction for something far bigger? That was only just beginning to unfold. Jedediah walked slowly through the storm toward the slave quarters, the rain soaking his clothes and running down his face. The lantern light from the plantation house faded behind him as each step carried him farther from the danger of Reed's watchful eyes. Yet the true danger was not behind him. It was pressed against his chest, hidden beneath his shirt. The signed document that pretty Kate had written only a short time earlier. A paper that could change his life forever. The wind pushed against him as he crossed the muddy yard, and lightning flashed across the sky, briefly lighting the long rows of tobacco fields. In that bright flash, Jedediah stopped walking for a moment and looked toward the dark woods in the distance. Somewhere beyond those trees, another person had already taken a path toward freedom. Someone brave enough to run through a violent storm, rather than remain in chains. Jedediah wondered who it might be. Perhaps a man he worked beside every day. Perhaps someone he barely knew. Whoever it was had unknowingly created the distraction that allowed Kate to sign the paper, now hidden against his chest. Without those mysterious footprints, Reed would have continued questioning him inside that room until the truth came out. Jedediah resumed walking again, feeling the weight of the night pressing on his mind. For the first time in his life, freedom was no longer just a distant dream whispered in songs. It was real. It existed on a piece of paper that now belonged to him. But freedom also carried a heavy responsibility. Because once morning came, Reed would gather every worker in the yard and begin asking questions. If the overseer discovered that Kate had secretly signed a document granting freedom to one of the enslaved men, the consequences could shake the entire plantation. Jedediah reached the slave quarters and stepped quietly inside his small cabin. The storm continued roaring outside, while the other men slept on rough wooden beds around him. He removed the folded paper from inside his shirt and held it carefully near the dim lantern on the table. The ink of Kate's signature was still fresh. Jedediah stared at the document for a long time, hardly believing it was real. Then he folded it again and hid it carefully beneath a loose floorboard near his bed. That paper would remain there until the moment arrived to carry it beyond the plantation gates. Morning came slowly after the long, violent storm. Gray clouds covered the sky, and the wet fields glistened under the weak sunlight. Reed wasted no time gathering the workers into the yard just as he promised. One by one, he questioned them about the footprints leading toward the woods. His voice carried suspicion with every question. But no one spoke. The mystery runner had vanished into the forest during the storm and left no clear trail behind. Jedediah stood among the other men calmly, while Reed studied their faces carefully. Yet the overseer could not find proof against anyone. By midday, the search party returned from the woods with nothing. The rain had washed away the tracks completely. Reed was frustrated, but even he had to admit the runner was gone. As the workers slowly returned to their duties, Jedediah felt a quiet understanding settle inside him. Somewhere beyond the forest, a person was breathing free air for the first time. And inside the plantation house, Pretty Kate carried her own dangerous secret. That night, after darkness fell again, a house servant quietly approached Jedediah near the barn and handed him a small sealed envelope. The servant said only 3 words before leaving. From the mistress. Jedediah opened the envelope carefully under the lantern light. Inside was a second document bearing the official stamp of the county clerk. Kate had moved faster than he ever expected. The legal process had already begun. The paper confirmed that Jedediah's freedom would soon be recognized by law. Jedediah looked toward the large house on the hill, where a single light burned in the upstairs window. Pretty Kate stood there watching the dark fields, knowing that the decision she made during the stormy night had already begun changing lives. Jedediah understood then that freedom was not only about leaving chains behind. It was also about carrying courage into the unknown future. Within weeks, he would walk away from the plantation gates, not as property, but as a free man ready to search for his lost family and build a life no overseer could control. The storm that night had not only hidden an escape, it had quietly opened the door to another. And that is where the story of Pretty Kate and Jedediah comes to its powerful end. A simple request to carry someone to her room turned into a moment that changed 2 lives forever. One decision made during a storm created a path toward a freedom that no one on that plantation could fully predict. History often moves quietly like that, through small moments that grow into powerful change. If you enjoyed this story, let us know where you are watching from. Your city, your state, and the time there right now. We always love seeing our global community here on History Bank. And if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please take a moment to subscribe and like the video so you never miss another powerful historical story like this one. Your support helps us continue bringing these incredible stories of courage, mystery, and human resilience to life. Until our next story, stay curious and keep exploring history with us here on History Bank.